Our next question comes from John out of Roanoke, Virginia. He writes, when was sin created? It seems that sin entered the world through Adam, but it seems as though Satan was the first created being to have sinned, along with the angels that fell with him. I have been thinking about this, and in my reading this morning, I read 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, which talks about God not sparing the angels when they sinned. Thank you.
Well, John, it's an excellent question. Appreciate you sending it in from Roanoke, Virginia. I just turned to Genesis. Let me just give some backdrop here. First of all, just for clarification, when was sin created? Sin was never created in the sense that God is the only creator, and everything that he created, the scripture says, is good. So just to be precise in language, and I know what you mean, while sin was not created, it was allowed, and I think your question is, when did sin begin? And did it begin with Adam or with Satan? Well, obviously it began with Satan, because Satan was already dealing with an unfallen person in the garden. And so if it began with Satan, when did it come into Satan's realm? Well, there's a couple of different views, actually three major views. One view is called the gap theory. And the argument is, and by the way, I cover this in my series on Genesis. There's so much in Genesis. So much that we need to know. Oftentimes people say, well, if I had like 2 or 3 books that I really need to know, what do I need to learn? Genesis, Acts, and Romans. Those would be the 3 most critical books that you could really learn. In Genesis, you find in kernel form really all the major doctrines that are unfolded in Scripture. So some say between Genesis 1 and Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there's a gap. And they say that during that gap, God created the angels. That's why Satan was there in the garden. And he tempted Eve. They say that God made animals like dinosaurs. They say that there was a caveman-type race that many say we evolved from, and so theistic evolution. But some put this gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Why do they do that? Because modern science has said that the world is, depending on who you read, somewhere around 4 to 5 billion years old. And so if you take the Bible at face value, the scripture would teach the world is about 6,000 years old. And so you have some who say, well, I don't want to deny the creation account. And I'm talking about non-theistic evolutionists who want to affirm the creation of man as a direct act of God. And yet they want to snuggle up to science and say, well, this world is millions and millions of years old. So they create this gap in order to try to harmonize the facts of what we read in Scripture and the genealogy accounts with what we read in what we're taught in science. It's erroneous. It's basically man wanting to please God. It goes against the clear line of Scripture. It goes against what Scripture itself describes of itself. So the gap theory, I throw that out. A second view describes a different kind of gap. And again, I cover this in my series on Genesis, and they say there's a gap between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. And by the way, I should say that there are some good, solid creationists who hold to this view. And so they would say that the angels were also created in the first week before man, and they basically put the creation of the angels somewhere between Genesis 1 and Genesis chapter 2. Well, the problem with that is there's nothing in the Bible that says that. That's what we call not exegesis, where you read out the text, but you're reading into the text. But their argument from Genesis 1:31, which I have open here, it says, and God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning was the 6th day. And so their argument is if everything God made was good, in fact, he'll pronounce it as very good at one point, then angels were already created and they were created good because they were created of God. Angels are not eternal. They're created beings, clearly. No one debates that. Again, the problem with that is twofold. One, when you read, and this goes back to one of the earlier questions today, the fall of Satan in Isaiah 14, in Ezekiel chapter 28, there's a distinction when God describes angels between the creation of angels and the creation of the earth. So when God pronounces everything very good, and by the way, he pronounces a 6-day creation, 6 literal 24-hour days with no long days in the long day theory or no gaps of time between the 6 24 days of creation. How do you know that? Because God gives us divine commentary. In Exodus 20, when Moses reviews the creation of the world, he says, in 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth, and the 7th day he rested. And then he makes application. Even so, you should work 6 days, and on the 7th day, you should rest. And so, again, 6-day literal creation, everything is good. But I think when God describes the creation of the heavens and the earth, he's not describing the third heaven. And in Hebrew, there's what we call a superlative. And so in the book of Nehemiah, he describes, I've turned to Nehemiah 9 and verse 6. Nehemiah says, "You alone are the Lord. You have made the heavens, the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts." Hosts here are reference not to the stars, but to angels. Again, one of the symbols used for angels. No one debates that. "And the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them, you give life to them, and the heavenly hosts bow down before you." So Nehemiah uses this additional phrase called the heaven of heavens. It's in Hebrew what we call a superlative, where you join a noun with its own genitive and it becomes a superlative. We use superlatives in English. We say, well, the Bible is the book of books, meaning it's the book of all books, the greatest book. Or even in Hebrew, in the 9th chapter of Genesis, Ham who's described as the father of Canaan. His offspring are going to be the slave of slaves, the lowest of slaves. Or even when Moses describes the tabernacle, he speaks of the Holy of Holies, meaning the most holy place. Or in the New Testament, we speak of the King of Kings, meaning the greatest of all kings. And so when he speaks of the heaven of heavens, he's qualifying that this is not just the heavens and the earth that God created in those 6 days, but the third heaven. And by the way, the third heaven, or the heaven of heavens, in about 7 or 8 Old Testament passages that I bring out in my course on angelology, is the place where you find the presence of God, holy angels. What I'm trying to say is that there's good evidence that the third heaven, with all of its angels, had already been created prior to the 6 days of creation. And I think Ezekiel 28 affirms that, as does Isaiah chapter 14. So my take, by the way, Job is also interesting, because in the book of Job, I suppose I should turn there. Let me turn there because I can't quote the verse out of memory. In Job chapter 38, God is responding to Job, and he makes this statement in verse 4, starting in verse 4. "Were you there when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." Obviously he doesn't. Obviously he was not there when God laid the foundation of the earth. "Who set its measurements, since you know, or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, shouted for joy?" Who's he speaking about? He's speaking about angels. So when God laid the foundations of the earth, according to the book of Job, the angels were already created. And so there is this angelic war that will later take place, a rebellion against God led by this holy cherub named Lucifer, the morning star. He becomes Satan. He becomes our adversary. We know him best as probably the devil. And he rebels, and a third of the angels rebel with him. And that's why you find him in a perfect universe, in the sense of the world that God has created, that he's made Adam to live in, where he's able to lure Adam and Eve into sin.
Dr. Carl Broggi answers your questions about the Bible and living the Christian life Tuesday mornings at 11 on The Light, 88.7 FM, and online around the world at wagp.net.